Hi, everyone. Welcome tonight to talking about climate resilient yards and gardens. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Diana Alfuth, and I have been hanging around here for many years. So I just recently retired as horticulture educator for UW Extension for Pierce, Polk, and St. Croix counties after 23 years. My background is bachelor's and master's in horticulture from University of Minnesota, and a lot of focus on design by general horticulture. And so I have been around talking about a lot of different topics for a lot of years. So most everyone has seen or heard of me at some point. But I really appreciate the library having me back here as part of this is part of the sustainability series stuff that they do. And so my topic tonight is climate resilient yards and gardens. And if you're here, you already know that there's climate change issues going on, right? And we're not going to get political about any of that, but the reality is climate is changing. And so as homeowners and gardeners, that affects things. So, things have changed a lot since just in the last 20 years, and things are a whole lot less predictable, and we have a lot more extremes. And so what we're looking at tonight is, there's not like I can say, do this, do that, do that, do that, but it's more consider this, consider that, be prepared for this, be prepared for that. So you don't have to go home and totally redo all of your garden landscape right away, right? But as you make changes or as you add things, just keeping in mind the fact that things aren't as predictable and stable as they used to be will help you to make better choices that will last a long time. So my like when I learned landscape design over at University of Minnesota, and what I've taught so I taught at Minnesota, I taught at UW River Falls too, and the title of my class is like Sustainable Landscape Design. And the word sustainable is one of the most overused and confusing terms out there, right? And so depending on what you're talking about, sustainable, as I applied it to landscape design, is that you could design and install your landscape and it's going to look great. And then 5 years later, it's still going to look great. And 15 years later, it's going to look great. Okay. It doesn't mean that you don't have maintenance, that you don't have things happen, you don't have to replace things. But the idea is that if you design it sustainably and you install it correctly, so you put in that black edging correctly so that it doesn't pop up, right? And that you plant the tree in the right place so that in 10 years you don't have to cut it down because it's knocking on your house windows, stuff like that. The idea is that the landscape should sustain itself with just the basic and minimal inputs and maintenance. Okay. So that's really what we're looking for. We're never going to have a maintenance-free landscape, and we don't want to either, right? Because it's kind of fun to play out in the landscape, although not right now, because right now it's like, oh, all that winter cleanup stuff, and it's just kind of a chore, but things are greening up fast. All right, so first, just a little bit of background and basic stuff. Again, you already know, you're here, you know about the climate issues, okay? But again, just to confirm that we're not talking about the weather, we're talking about the overall climate, but really we're talking about the weather, right? So weather is the state of the atmosphere at a given time and place, described by the temperature, the moisture, and wind. Isn't that a cool picture? Those little popcorn. I just took that. What day did we have Monday did we have the severe line go through? So that was just after it passed us. And the clouds looked so weird. I stepped out, was going to send the horses out, and it's like, wow, those are cool clouds. I just took that picture, and it was kind of fun to put it in here right away. And then climate is the meteorological conditions that include temperature and precipitation, but that's the over time thing. So it's not in a given snapshot thing. I also, before I go too much further, I want to give credit to my dear friend and former colleague, Lisa Johnson, who is the horticulture educator in Dane County in Madison, because when I had to prepare for this, I knew she had done some some presentations like this, and it's like, it's a great direction to start where I can get some stats and graphs and everything. It's just, so I didn't have to work as hard. So anyway, she contributed to a bunch of this, and I'll show you what I mean. So like this cool little graph, she already had it, so I didn't have to go looking for it. But what we're really concerned about is these extreme weather conditions that we're getting, these extreme events, and we're having more and more of them. And you can see just this graph shows that billion-dollar, the big expensive ones, how many more of them we are getting. So this goes 1980 to 2021, and look at how that's a very steady uptick on that. And this graph only goes to 2021. So think of what we had last year, Hurricane Helene and, all this stuff, the LA wildfires, all, even more of it. So this is directly related to the change in climate, and the more moisture in the air, the more warmth in the air, and the ability for these storms to get bigger and stronger and create more and more damage for us. This, I don't want to get into all the little details of it, but you can see this is talking about the mean annual temperatures and how they've increased. So this graph starts at 1900, and you can see that there were more cooler than normal kinds of things. And yes, there were some hot things in there, especially, you look at during the Dust Bowl, the 1933 kind of things. We got those big red spikes on there and stuff. But now, towards the end, everything is big red spikes up. And that's just showing. So whether you want to debate the cause of climate change and the cause of what used to be called global warming, you can't debate that it's happening, because thermometers don't lie. It's happening. Okay. Now, if you live in a city versus in the rural, this will affect you even more, because in town, I mean, we all know that if you even live in the city of River Falls, in winter, you might not get a frost, whereas 4 miles out of town, there is a frost. Okay, so there's this heat island effect, even in a little city like River Falls. If you live in a more urban area, the bigger the urban area, the more heat and the more heat impact, and the less ability for the environment to withstand that heat there is. Okay, so this goes to looking at the disparity too of how the climate change and the extremes will affect different people. And it does tend to have a bigger impact on inner city people and neighborhoods where there hasn't been a conscious investment in things like green space and trees and that sort of thing. So, back in the 1970s and stuff, when Dutch elm came through, a lot of neighborhoods, the older neighborhoods, all the elms died and they lost that tree canopy. And in a lot of neighborhoods, especially the poorer ones, they didn't bother to spend money to replace trees. And so there's a lot more cement, there's a lot more blacktop, all of those kinds of things. Plus, because we are such a mobile society, we've built our roads wider, we've built our roads, more lanes, more sidewalks, more bike lanes, more of hard surface. And so we don't have that green space, especially in bigger cities. So if you're out in the country and you're out in the rural area, you've got a whole lot more of that, but it's still going to affect you, but not as much as your friends and family that live in town. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what we're currently seeing specifically in Wisconsin, because this climate change and these extremes are affecting different areas very differently. Okay. And so we have always had the ability to get a drought, right? Remember, like 1980, there was a No, not 88. Yes, it was 1988. We had a really, really bad drought where it stopped snowing on February 2nd, and then we had like 80s in late February, and we didn't get any rain the whole rest of the summer, kind of thing. And there was a lot of impact, residual impact from that. So we've always had droughts and flood years and stuff, but we're getting more of them, and certain areas get it more than others. Okay. So we're going to look at what we're seeing specifically in Wisconsin, and just, the overview is we're getting more extreme weather events. Now, you're going to listen to me talk about that, and you're going to go, hey, winter wasn't extreme this year, was it? It's hardly a winter, and now we've had kind of two winters that really weren't that bad. We didn't have, the 30-inch snowstorm like we did the Halloween snowstorm of 90 something that was. But we do have more extreme weather events. We have drought periods and we have heavy rain periods. So we have less of that nice in between stuff going on. Spring is earlier, certainly was this year. We have earlier blooming. Spring tried to get here earlier this year, but it just kind of did the fits and starts thing, and it's still not feeling real springy all the time. But we have earlier blooming on things, and we have a later onset of winter. So think about last fall. I was eating tomatoes from the garden in November because it was like Halloween before it really frosted enough in my garden to kill my tomato plants. And then I picked all the green ones and brought them in, and it took 3 weeks for them to ripen. And so falls are not getting as cold as quickly. We have wetter springs. So remember last spring, it was so wet. Okay. I was trying to make hay in May and couldn't. We didn't get our first crop hay in until the beginning of July because it was so wet last year. Now, conversely, on my drive here, I was listening to Minnesota Public Radio, and Paul Huttner, the meteorologist, was on, and he said, the forecast looks like there's going to be a blocking pattern and keep all the rain to the south, and we're going to have a warmer and drier May than normal. So we're not having a wetter spring this year, according to the forecast right now. But in general, and again, in any given year, it's not exactly that way, but it's the overall trend. And that, again, is the weather versus climate thing. Okay. We are going to have warmer and wetter winters and late winter warm-ups. So we definitely had a warmer than normal winter again. The last few winters have not been as cold as they were when I was a kid, right? And late winter warm-ups means that, like, the average temperature in February, it's been warmer than average. So that late winter stuff, we get these warm-ups. Now that does affect things, because if it warms up enough, so you guys know what phenology is? Okay, phenology refers to, so everything in nature develops and occurs according to degree days, and it's the temperature. So what I'm getting at is, over winter, there are buds on the trees, right? And once it gets above 50 degrees, the chemical reactions in those buds start happening, and that's breaking down cells and creating enzymes and stuff that cause those buds to open. Okay? And degree days add up. So anytime that it's above 50 degrees, if it's 60 degrees, you get 10 degree days. If the next day it's 55, you get 5 degree days. And that all adds up. And everything happens at the same number of degree days each year. So dandelions, the first dandelion blooms come out at about 50 degree days. There are dandelions out there, so we're blooming. So we're there already, okay? Certain insects will hatch at 75-degree days. Eastern tent caterpillar, you know, the things that make the big tents in the plum trees and cherry trees and apple trees in spring, they're starting in southern Wisconsin already. I haven't seen any up here yet, but they're one of the earliest hatching insects, and they're at like 75-degree days or something like that. So everything happens in the same order every year because it's based on degree days. But the problem is, if we get above 50 in February, those degree days start clocking. Okay. And we had a lot of people were concerned, oh, my trees are budding out, you know, in March, and that's not normal. So if things bud out early, for example, and then we get normal cold temperatures, those things can be damaged and or even killed. And so people always say, well, does this cold winter, does that mean we'll have less emerald ash borer or fewer Japanese beetles or things like that? And you can't ever predict that necessarily, because it's not just how cold winter was that affects it, but it's the spring weather and the fluctuations. Because if things start like coming out of dormancy and then they're crashed with cold or wet or something, that weather affects the insects and plants a whole lot more than the winter did. Okay, so warm winters and those late winter warm-ups, they feel nice to us, right? It's so nice when you don't have to put quite as many layers on to go outside in spring, but it's not necessarily good for our plants and animals. Species range shifts and phenological impacts. So there are going to be some plants that just can't handle the new weather that we're going to have, and others that can't. So we'll get to have things that we didn't used to. So anybody in here have an apricot tree? Okay. So apricots have been around a long time. The trees are perfectly hardy, but not many people would plant them because they you can only expect a fruit crop like 1 in every 5 years. This was 20 years ago. Okay. And that's because they bloom really early in the spring, and the blossoms would normally get hit by a late freeze and they would die and you wouldn't get any fruit. So they bloom really pretty and they smell nice, but you couldn't count on fruit and stuff. Well, it's 1 in 5 years anymore. It's more like, 2 out of 3 years you're going to get a crop. And so there's changes that both benefit and hurt us, but there are changes going on there. And one of the other things that we're going to be looking at are increased weed, insect, and disease pressure, because again, our cold winters kind of helps keep the riffraff out, right? And if it's not as cold, then certain things are going to be able to come into the area that otherwise would have been more south. Or we might start getting more than one generation a year. So like Colorado potato bugs, anybody experienced Colorado potato bugs ever? Okay, we normally just have one generation of Colorado potato bugs. They overwinter as an adult, and in early May, they crawl out and they walk along. They find your potato plants, they lay their eggs. The babies eat all the leaves and cause all kinds of damage and stuff. And then they get big enough, they fall to the ground. They go through all of their instars. They turn into the adult and stuff, and then they hang out till winter. So they only have one generation a year. If we have a really would have a warm early spring, we could get 2 generations a year. Now it's like we expect 2 generations a year. So we have more damage that goes on for potato crops and other crops that they bother, like eggplants and such. So we're going to have more insect issues. We're likely going to have more diseases, especially because wetter springs. Last year, we had a lot of diseases around, right? A lot of fungal diseases. Crab apples and apples and stuff had lots of bad leaves. And that's because we had such a wet spring, because the cool, wet weather in the spring is exactly what a lot of fungal diseases want. You've got tender baby leaves coming out that those spores can land on. If it's wet, poof, they're in there, and then it's off to the races all summer long. So we're going to have more of those kinds of things to deal with as well. So those are the, in a nutshell, impacts that we're going to have to deal with. Um, Now, one of the things too to keep in mind is that it's not just warming up like our winter is warmer than it used to be. We're getting warmer in every season. And so you can see with these slides here, the graph shows like the northern 2/3 of Wisconsin there. In winter, we're like 5 degrees warmer than we used to be. And in spring, we're like 3 degrees warmer. And in summer, we're like 2 degrees warmer, and same with fall. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but we're getting warmer in all of the seasons. And that makes a big difference. So, one of the reasons that we get these bigger, heavier rainfalls is because the warmer air is, the more moisture it can hold in it. So the more humidity and that kind of thing. So then when a trigger comes along, like a cold front or whatever up in the atmosphere and causes storms, there's more water to pour out of there in a short amount of time. And so when we're warmer in every season, we have more potential for big dumps of whether it's rain or snow, because the air can hold more more water. Okay. The other thing is that we're having more winter or more warming in the winter. Okay. So we've gone up like 5 degrees in winter and only 2 degrees in summer, and at nighttime than in daytime. So our night temperatures don't get down as low. And that's important because a lot of plants and insects and other critters too, but especially plants, they need to cool down at night. And if they don't cool down at night as much, they don't do respiration as well. And respiration is where, so during the day, plants are out in the sunlight, they do photosynthesis, they create carbohydrates in the cells. And at night, they break those carbohydrate molecules apart. That releases energy, and that's how plants get the energy they need to grow, just like us digesting food. We break apart molecules and the energy is released. Okay. So if it doesn't get cool enough, they don't do that metabolism as efficiently and as well. So what we'll see is maybe not as good of flowering and fruiting because they're not getting as much energy out of their food basically as they should be. They might be more susceptible to diseases. They might grow leggier and not as strong. So there's a lot of little subtle differences that we're not going to be able to say, oh, that's because it's not as cool at night and my plant's not getting anything, but there's going to be a gradual decrease in the overall quality, and that just adds up, right? You all know that the hardiness zones changed a few years ago, right? So the hardiness zones, the plant hardiness map, it's released by every 20 years. And it is based on the temperatures for the previous 30 years. So they release the map every 20 years, but what they do is they take all the temperatures and they look for the average annual extreme minimum temperature. So what that means is the coldest winter temperature that we got. And so based on the last 30 years, this is what they come up with, okay? And so you can see that in the 2012 old map versus the 2023, which was 20 years, took them an extra year to get it published, okay? But look at how the zones have changed and how the warmer zones have expanded. And so we here in River Falls, you know, we were on the edge of zone 4B for a 4B before, and now we're solidly in zone B. And if you live in town with that heat island kind of a thing, you could very likely be a zone 5 in your backyard. A lot of the Twin Cities has all changed into zone 5B. Now, does that mean you should go out and they never planted before because they were zone 5 and planted? Maybe. Okay. Now we have to understand though, this is the trend, and on any given winter, we could have 40 below, right? Because we can still get those extremes and we can still get those cold things. So if you really want something like a really nice buddleia, or that bright red magnolia, or something or those roses that are zone 5, and if you're willing to take the risk that it's going to die and you're out that money, you know, this is telling you, go ahead and take a chance, have some fun with it. So the other thing is that our precipitation has increased by about 20% since 1950 in the lower half of the state. So this is the historical change in annual precipitation, and you can see the lower part of the state and all the way up to our area, we're getting more rain than we used to. And it's 20% more. Now, a lot of that comes in single storms. Okay, so whereas we might have used to have gotten a thunderstorm and gotten a ½ inch of rain, now we get an inch. And so we may or may not have more rain events, but we're getting more water out of there. That's good from a standpoint that I don't have to run the sprinkler as much or something like that, but it also causes problems. It causes problems with flooding and erosion and runoff and diseases that like moisture. So if you're in the northern part of the state, though, it's really not changed as much. It's only like 5%. And that's what I mean about you really have to look at where you are, because we can't just say that all this applies to everywhere in Wisconsin. There are differences. So here's the other, the seasonal thing. So we are 20% more in winter, although this last winter, that's going to skew the results now. Spring, summer, and fall. But look at the summer map, because that northwestern part of Wisconsin actually has had 10% less rain, less moisture than historically it's received. So they've been more in the drought areas stuff. And that, if that trend, this is the trend. If that's continuing, they're going to have to plan more for drought, and we have to plan more for excess water. So it really is important for people to know where they are in these maps. And you can see the rest of northern Wisconsin, they aren't necessarily getting more rain than we are. We're also getting more of the big rainfall. So the 100-year, it's like, oh, only once in 100 years would you get this amount. And there's getting a lot more of those, and you can see that it kind of follows that line of the wetter area that was on the other map. And you can see there's a 7.31 up there right at River Falls. Do you remember that one? That was a few years ago when River Falls really flooded, and that whole basin by Hoffman Park was, 12 feet of water, and things, bridges were washed out and all that stuff. We had that 7 inches of rain in one storm. So that was, the 100-year rainfalls. But even just to the east, we've got Menominee and Eau Claire and Mondo, we're getting more of those big ones. And this map is only showing the ones that reach the 100-year marker. Okay. So there's still plenty of 3-inch storms that we've got that don't show up on this map. But On the impact of these is you get a big storm, you need to be worried in your yard and garden about where that water's going. Okay. And is it going to cause damage? And how do you keep it from washing all of your garden soil into the Kinnickinnic River? Okay. So those are the more, that is, should always have been a concern, but it's even more of a concern now because we expect these things. So the summary of what's happening in Wisconsin before we get into what to do about it: warmer overall, more hot days. We're going to have more days above 90 degrees. That's bad for human health. That's your plants. Things like tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and squash, we call them warm season plants. They like hot weather, right? But when it gets above 86 degrees, they're not happy either. And they will abort flowers and fruit. They will shut down and not grow and stuff. So our garden plants will be affected when it gets to 90 degrees. And if we're having more of those 90-degree days, when people say, why didn't they have many tomatoes? Or why didn't they have, why don't I have any peppers coming in? It's like, well, you probably had baby peppers and then we got 90 degrees and they all fell off and they aborted because that's the natural um, response from plants. So more 90-degree days, more warming in winter and spring than summer and fall. So our winter, it's kind of hard to, it's hard to complain about winter not being as cold, right? But again, all of our ecosystem our native ecosystem is based on it being cold in winter. More warming at night than during the day. We're going to have a longer frost-free growing season. We certainly had that last year. And fewer cold nights below zero. We definitely had that this winter. Precipitation, we're going to have more water normally. But again, in any given year or in any given time period, we can get into the drought, less snow, more rain in winter. So those slushy days or ice storms are more likely to happen because it's not quite as cold. More drought periods because, again, the weather gets all goofed up. And then fewer average events, more of those bigger, large dumps. So one of the things, there's been in the news weather over the last few years is the polar vortex, and we get these really cold spells and people would say, well, I thought we had global warming. That just shows we really don't. Look how cold it is, okay? But that is actually the result of it because there is always the polar vortex, this really cold spell that's up around the poles. And these warmer air bangs into that and it knocks a chunk off that comes down and gets us. So it is actually polar vortexes, and when we do get those cold spells, are actually related to the overall warming of the earth. And so because of all of that whole overall thing, we can't say exactly what we're going to get, but these are the trends. So these shifting ranges of plants and animals, there are going to be things that just don't like warmer winters, that don't like warmer summers, that don't like warmer nights, and also don't like the wetter soil. And they're not going to do as well here. So native things like paper birch, quaking aspen, balsam fir, black spruce is going to decline the farther south you are, and they're just not going to be as happy. So does it mean they're totally going to disappear in a year? No, but they're not going to reseed as easily. Seedlings aren't going to take hold as well. And there'll be other things that do like the conditions more. So like right now, we have mostly sugar maples around Pierce County, lots of, sap collection and stuff like that. If you get further north, it's more red maples We don't have we have some red maples around here, but it's predominantly sugar maples. North, get up by, Highway 8 and stuff, is predominantly red maples from the maple standpoint. Well, that whole thing might be shifting further north over time. And then, so the whole makeup of our woods and our wild areas may change. So if the trees change and the plants change, then the critters that survive on them are also going to change. So that's where we might get pests that we've never had to deal with before. We might lose some pests, I guess, that we've had to deal with, but we have to be prepared for that. Okay. And then the altered timing of migration, reproduction, and flowering, again, it goes up to that degree days thing. And there are concerns about mismatches forming. So, for example, if a particular insect needs the pollen of a particular flower to really complete its life cycle, and that insect hatches and that flower has already past its bloom time, there's no food there, we're going to lose that insect. Okay, so right now, hopefully, because everything happens with those degree days and happens in the same order, you would say, okay, if it blooms earlier, that insect should hatch earlier as well. But there's going to be some instances where it doesn't work that way, and there's going to be a mismatch, and that's going to affect just what's all part of our ecosystems. So this is just a cute little thing to think about. So, all know Aldo Leopold, big Wisconsin conservationist and stuff. And at his cabin by Baraboo, okay, from 1936 when he was doing things to 1998, the indicators of spring, because he would, note when stuff happened, on average 1.2 days earlier per decade. So in that amount of time, now the geese are arriving 29 days earlier, the cardinals are singing 22 days earlier, the robins are earlier, the baptisias in bloom 18 days earlier, marsh milkweed 13 days earlier. So things have sped up. And so again, it's hard to argue with that kind of a hard data that things definite art season is extended. So in the short term, as gardeners, what does this mean for us? So remember that we have this weather in every season thing. So first thing is, as I mentioned earlier, is look on the map where you are. Obviously, we're in River Falls talking. I'm assuming you all live in this area here. But what we can expect in summer is to have 10% more rain than we used to. Sounds good to me. You don't have to water, right? But that's going to mean more wet leaves, more fungal diseases, more waterlogged soil, more root rots, harder to get in the garden and work the soil because you never work muddy soil. So there's a lot of ways that we'll have to change our actions compared to when my mom was gardening 50 years ago, right? So the other thing is to make sure that there are going to be wet spells and there are going to be dry spells, and expect the unexpected and don't fret about it, but be prepared for it, right? So from the drought standpoint, you have to plan for droughts. And some of the things that we need to do are things that we've always talked about. Okay, so it's not like there's anything new and revolutionary here that we should be doing about, but it's just more important than ever that you do them or consider them. First one is mulching. And mulches serve a whole lot of different purposes. In the picture of the tomato plant there, that helps prevent tomato blight, soil splash up there, the fungal spores that get up there. So you should always mulch your tomatoes as soon as you plant them. Don't wait a day, do it right away, because that tomato blight starts the first time there's a raindrop that hits that soil and it splashes on. But the great thing about mulch is that it's going to hold moisture in the soil, so that helps keep the plant have even moisture levels, so less blossom and drought as well. But it also is going to hold your soil there if you get a heavy rainstorm, because I remember my first soils class, Dr. Cooper, I don't remember his first name, Terry Cooper, I think it was, at University of Minnesota. And I remember a test question, and it was, what is the cause of erosion? The answer is a raindrop. And it's true. And it stuck with me all these years, okay? But when a raindrop, have you ever gotten hit on the head by a big fat raindrop? It hurts, right? There's a lot of pressure and a lot of force coming from a raindrop. When it hits bare soil, it splashes that soil, those little soil particles. And then when there's a whole lot of friends of that raindrop and the rain's heavy, those soil particles float and then they erode off, right? So mulch is really, really important, not just from drought standpoint, but if we're going to be getting heavier and bigger rainstorms and downpours, that's going to help hold your soil in place as well. So mulch is super, super, super important. This is straw hay. That's great. It's a great kind of mulch to have. A lot of times we recommend that you like lay down a layer of cardboard or some newspaper and then put the straw on top. That helps, that stops the weeds. Any weed seeds that are in the soil can't germinate because they're in the dark. And so you are totally reducing your maintenance and protecting your soil and conserving water. So mulches are always important, but even more so now when we can expect droughts and heavy rainstorms, okay? Because we're going to expect droughts, have a plan for watering. What you do not want to do is go, wow, it hasn't rained in a while. Gee, my plants look a little droopy. And you pull out the hose and you put on the sprinkler, okay? Because that is the most inefficient kind of way to water. It's not a good idea because you're getting leaves wet, which is going to increase diseases. And a lot of that water evaporates before it hits the ground. And pulling a hose out and stuff is, an effort. You need to be prepared for watering. The ideal thing is that you would have a soaker hose or some kind of drip irrigation system. If you have that wound in there when you plant like that, then when you have to water, all you have to do is attach the hose at the end here and let it run for an hour. And that's the most efficient way to water. You're not splashing soil like you are with the overhead sprinkler, and you're using water the most efficiently, because even though we're not in LA where water is, always at a deficit, it seems, we're in Wisconsin, all our great water, and we take water for granted, but we can very easily get into lowering our deficits. If you're on a city water system, they'll put in like odd, even watering days, that sort of thing. We really do need to protect and conserve our precious water that we do have. So a drip irrigation system is super, super important. The other thing is to water only as needed when the soil begins to dry. So with all my years with Extension, a lot of my questions would come in and there would be problems. And I think overwatering causes way more problems in gardens than underwatering, because there are people who think you need to water that garden every day. And even like last year when we had the droughty stuff at the end of the season, and you guys listen to Larry Mueller's Garden Talk show on public radio? It's on every Friday, Wisconsin Public Radio, 11 to 12:30, 11 to 1 now, actually. And most of the episodes are call-ins, so you can call in your questions and stuff like that. And so I do it like 3 times a year, whatever, but I listen to it a lot of the other times. And people will say, my plants are doing well. I water every day and blah, blah, blah. And the other thing is I lurk on the Wisconsin gardening type of Facebook groups to see what people are talking about. And when we had the hot, dry spells, people said, I'm watering more. And then after work when I get home, there is no way your soil dries out. If it's an in-ground container, yes. If it's an in-ground garden, there's no way you should be watering that often. You should not, even if you have sandy soils, you absolutely should be 2 to 3 days between watering. And if the soil's wet, it's wet. and so people were killing their plants with root rot and waterlogging because it was so hot out. Well, yeah, we need to drink more water when it's hot out, but the plants still only need so much and the soil can still only hold so much. So make sure that you stick your finger in the soil, and if it's dry, an inch down, water. If it's moist on the surface yet, it's not ready to water. So don't overwater, because that's another thing. Because if you have already waterlogged soil and then the storm comes through and dumps 2 inches of rain, now in some ways you've wasted that rainfall, because that water has nowhere to go. Soil's already wet. Okay, so it's a most efficient use of not only your irrigation water, but the rainwater that's going to come. And then the other thing is to harvest rainwater when it does come. So rain barrels, directing water into a spot to make sure that it, like if you have a garden and stuff, making sure that good amount of the rainwater goes there to water those plants. But collecting that rainwater, like in rain barrels and stuff, so that then you can use that to water your containers or something like that, is really a useful thing. And we've always, should have been doing that. But now, because we can expect these extremes, it's even more valuable. Lawns. Okay, lawns are one of the things that when we get dry spells, they turn brown and people fret. Okay, and so a lot of times that's where a lot of irrigation water goes. And of course, you have to use overhead irrigation on a lawn, so it's not an efficient use. But the thing is to think about your yard and garden now and be prepared for this and ask yourself, do I need lawn there? Now, I am not a lawn shamer. I mean, I think, a lot of people say, oh, nobody should have lawns. They're just a waste. They're an environmental. I disagree with that. I think lawns, at least some lawn, is perfectly fine. I think they have a lot of value. I think lawns raise families, right? From the time you bring home the little baby and lay it down outside on the blanket under the tree to, get some fresh air. Toddlers learn to walk if they fall on the lawn. It's a soft landing. Elementary school kids running around with squirt guns. High school kids, graduations, put the tent out, all that stuff. Lawn grass is valuable, okay? But you only get so much of it, right? So if your property is large enough that all of your lawn stuff, your activities happen over here, and then you got a whole lot more lawn over there that never gets used, consider getting that out of lawn. Okay, now there are different things that you can do. You can plant it into a no-mow grass mixture, which is what's in this picture here. And this is a mix of different kinds of fescues, grows about that tall, stops growing. You don't have to mow it. You don't have those inputs of a mower and all that stuff. And it's also much, much more drought tolerant. So even if we get a really extended drought, it's going to go off color and it's going to go into dormancy, but the taller grass is, the deeper roots are. And that's why you should put your mower on its highest, 4 inches on its highest setting all the time, because that gives you deeper roots. So you're going to get a couple days more of happy grass when a drought hits than if you are mowing your grass short and you have short little roots in there. So this stuff is great, especially if it's in like I say, an off area. You can still walk on it, you can still run on it, you can still do all those things, but you're not maintaining it, and it's going to be able to handle the weather extremes better. You can also look at, there's some sedges that could go in an off place like this. They're not going to be that great for your front yard that you want to look nice, okay? And you should have that nice lawn in your front yard if you want it, right? But if you do have that lawn, make sure that you're maintaining it in the best way. Now we can do a whole nother talk on that. I think we have done talks on that. But it's important that you mow the highest that you can. Decide ahead of time that if you get 3 weeks of drought and the grass starts turning brown, are you going to let it go dormant? Because our lawns can go dormant for like up to 4 weeks before, and then if it rains, they come back. After 4 weeks, they will start dying off because they're using up all of their reserves in there. So you have to, kind of plan ahead. If we get into a drought, am I going to let it go? Or am I going to water it a few times a week to keep it from going dormant? Or am I dormant for 3 weeks, and if it hasn't rained yet, then I'm going to water it and pull it out of dormancy? But have that plan in mind, and try to know what your tolerance level is and what's acceptable to you, okay? And then it might be that you water your front yard and you let your backyard go dormant. Or again, if you have a bigger property, you don't keep it all nice and green. The other thing are bee lawns. Have you heard of bee lawns? It's a real popular thing in this area. A lot of the reason is because the University of Minnesota really came up with this concept, and they have a lot of information on it. But this isn't for everybody, okay? And it's basically, there's some grass in there, but there's other plants in there that have blooms, and they're short growing and they have blooms, so they're providing pollen for bees. But they might be more drought tolerant than Kentucky bluegrass, typical lawn grass. So that might be something for you to consider. You've probably also heard of clover, putting clover yards. So the research has shown that if you want to change your yard and you don't want to have all grass, it's not really environmentally sound to have all clover, because what would be out there right now? Here. There would be like no growth, because clover dies back in winter, okay? So there's more runoff, there's more weed seeds that can get in because there's no grass canopy. So the research shows that the best is to have a 50-50 mix. So the clover is good because it doesn't turn brown as fast as lawn grass will during a drought, okay? But having the grass there helps hold the soil and helps to green up earlier in the spring and stay around longer in the fall, because it's not as freeze sensitive as clover is. So, but those are options to consider. Sure.
I've also found that when people switch to clover, they're killing off. It's a different management strategy, because that grass will help mow it easier. When you have a lot of clovers, it'll it'll be harder on your mower. So that's part of it.
Yeah. So the
Expectation of mowing.
The comment is that if you have a lot of clover, your management strategies are a little different. So it affects your mower, it affects your mower blades. The other thing is that, yes, clover fixes nitrogen from the air, and so that helps to feed the nitrogen to the grass. but it doesn't mean that you don't mow your lawn anymore. And the other management strategy that changes is just because you have a clover lawn or a clover and grass lawn does not mean you're not going to get dandelions and other weeds in there. So now you have a little bit more of a challenge, because if you don't like dandelions in there, with an all grass lawn, you can put a broadleaf herbicide on to kill the dandelions and the grass lives. But the herbicide will damage the clover. And depending on which herbicide you use, like 2,4-D is clover can shrug off some 2,4-D, but it'll still be damaged. But if you really douse your whole lawn, you're probably going to kill off your clover. So you are absolutely right. Management strategies, if you're trying to have a clover grass lawn, have their own challenges, okay? And not that you can't deal with it, not that you can't do it. You can still spot spray those dandelions to get them out of there, right? Without killing off all your clover. But you have to be aware of the different management strategies. So remember, I want to say like 20 years ago, the term xeriscaping was really, all over the place. And it was especially important out west. And it's basically using drought tolerant plants in dry climates and stuff like that. And we didn't think about it that much around here in Wisconsin because we had adequate rain and stuff like that. But that term doesn't seem to be out there that much anymore. But if you go looking at that term, you will find different strategies for xeriscaping, which basically are for dealing with droughty conditions. And especially if you happen to have like a sandy soil, it would be even more applicable to you. So there's a lot of information out there on xeriscaping, but it could be a little older just because it doesn't seem to be the fad in the yard and garden world lately. So the thing is that from this point on, your plant selection will be key. You have to start thinking about any new plants that you plant as not, it's pretty, I love it, but more, can this plant handle the extremes? Because you don't want to plant something and just have it die right away because it couldn't handle the extremes. So it's really important first, of course, as always, to know your site, know your conditions, your sunlight, your soil, that sort of thing. But also looking at those maps that I had up there before, are you expecting more water than in the past, or are you in that northwestern part of the state where things are going to be drier than you're used to, and picking plants that way? So another part of this whole climate change is heat. Like I said earlier, there's going to be more days 90 degrees and above. And heat, as the heat grows, it builds up, it affects not just us, but our animals, wildlife. I know last year when it was a couple days in the 90s, there were pictures on the internet of squirrels panting because they were so hot, and it's going to affect the plants. So look at ways just in your own yard to try to mitigate that heat. And one of the best things is properly planted and sited trees. So proper landscaping can really reduce your energy costs. And one of the things that we're looking at for heat mitigation, of course, is shade. So if you can have a big tree canopy shading your house, especially the southwest corner where the worst of the sun hits, in summer, that's going to reduce the heat buildup in your house, reduce your air conditioner needs, that sort of thing. But also think about shading your blacktop driveway, okay? Because that blacktop gets really, really hot, and then that heat is given off after the sun goes down. And that affects all the plants around your driveway because, again, they don't get that cool down that they need at night. The other thing is your car. If it's parked out there in the driveway, get your car shaded, right? And you'll use less gas with air conditioning once you get in it, that sort of thing. Another thing to consider are vines or trellises with vines on it along those areas that you want to create some shade. So along, like just this far out from your west walls, because the west actually often collect more heat than the south, but south or west walls to shade the walls of your house. Because again, your siding on your house, if it heats up a lot, then at night it's giving off that heat. So it's not just your air conditioning needs, but it's your foundation plantings and stuff that are going to have that heat later into the night. Whereas if you put some vines up there, those plants are not going to absorb that heat and release it all night. Does that make sense? So look at places that absorb sun and absorb heat and try to shade them. Okay. Just from the standpoint of heat absorption. And then when you're planting these trees, look at the tree selection because, again, like I said, you're not going to plant a paper birch. I mean, you really shouldn't plant a paper birch in a landscape now anyway, because they have a couple of insect issues that they get if they're not in the cool woods. But make sure that you're choosing the trees right and use keystone tree species. I'll talk about that in a minute. Do you guys know what a keystone tree or a keystone plant is? Okay, I'll talk about that in just a second here. So look at, there's an article here. Yeah, there's a big long link there. Don't worry about it. If you just Google UW Extension trees for climate change, it's going to come up, right? And Minnesota's got their list and stuff too. But look at what the tree specialists are recommending for climate resilient trees because it's changing. And of course, trees have 50, 60, 70 year lifespans. You want to plant something that's not going to struggle in that time frame because of the changing climate. Plan for large, so we talked about drought, but now we got to look at floods too. We got to plan for these large rain events. So you might consider, especially if you have a heavier clayey soil, planting your flower beds on berms so that they're raised up a little bit. That's going to help that soil dry out and drain a little bit more. And when these floods come, the water will be on the edges of the berms, on the grass, or moving off of the area. So think about creating berms. At the very least, you don't want your garden beds to be lower than the surrounding grounds because these heavy rain, you don't want to flood in there, right? Because that water is going to stay in there for a long time. That's when we start getting root rots and just plants that don't get enough oxygen to the roots. They can't take up nutrients and they don't do well. If you have lower spots, and especially in the shade, look at plants, make sure that you're not planting something in there that like a sedum that wants dry soil. Okay, make sure that it's something that can handle wetter conditions. And then the other thing is, because we can expect droughts and we can expect floods, okay, what plants can handle both of them? And this, we go back to the native prairie plants. So the native prairie potholes, in the prairies, it would be these ponds that really didn't have a spring or anything, but they fill up with snow melt or rainwater, and then it's a pond there. And then as summer goes, the water level goes down, 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 down. Well, those plants that grow in there can handle being wet for a while, dry for a while. So those really, really good plants to be looking at no matter what your conditions are, because those are good plants that indicate they can handle those extremes. For vegetable beds, this might be a good reason to get into those raised beds, okay? I personally don't like raised beds because I like to use a rototiller and you got to lift that up to raised beds. And when I had raised beds, I kicked the soil out all over and stuff like that. So my raised beds are more just like berms, okay? But whatever you choose and what works best for you, they will dry out a little faster in spring. And since we expect these wetter springs, you'll be able to plant sooner and they will dry out sooner, also during the growing season. So you're going to have some kind of watering available. But if we get those big heavy dumps, they'll be able to recover from that faster. Make sure that you are, when you're choosing what seeds to plant, make sure that you're choosing ones that can handle wet, cool soils in spring and germinate. And you might look at things like beans or whatever that have a shorter time to harvest, because you might not be able to plant them as early as you used to because the soil might be too wet in spring. Okay, so you look for shorter season crops to be able to get your harvest, even though you got to plant it later. Peas would be a one. We usually plant peas early because they like cooler weather. But if your soil is too wet and waterlogged and you're getting a lot of rain and stuff, the pea seeds will rot before they sprout. So looking for varieties that can handle heat better so that they can plant later in the season is a thing to do. And then, we have been saying for years that we don't want runoff, right? Let the water soak in where it lands, and we want rain gardens. We want it to permeate on your soil and not run off into the lakes and rivers and streams and stuff. And that's still all true. But if we're going to be getting these big rain events, there's a limit to how much water your property can handle, right? So we definitely want rain gardens, like in the top right there, but we have to build rain gardens maybe bigger to be able to handle more rain, or have a secondary plan for when they overflow. So maybe there's a second rain garden farther downstream or something, but looking at where that water is going to go if you get too big of a rainfall. The rain garden book that we always use for calculating how big a rain garden needs to be based on the roof size and the drainage area and stuff was based on old rainfall amounts. Okay, so we need to bump that up a bit, and then beware of the runoff that is coming onto your property, like from your neighbors or across your property. So look at this picture here in this garden, and you can see that the water has run across there. Look at all that erosion, look at all that muck, all the good topsoil has disappeared. So make sure that you are aware of where the water's moving on your property, especially during big rains. Normally, snowmelt time is a good time to see where the water's running off. Well, we didn't have that this year, right? But in this case, you might need to build up a little dam or barrier upstream from your garden to make sure that the water goes around it. And again, something that we always should have been considering, but even more so now. And then winter, we expect wetter winters. We expect bigger snow dumps. We did that last year. We had some big snow dumps, not this year, right? But choosing your plants. So arborvitaes and evergreens that get smashed by heavy snows might not be your best choice unless you're willing to tie them up and give them some extra winter support. You want to make sure that you don't put them where, snow's going to drift off the roof and land on them and really nail them. The other thing is, like, alongside driveways and sidewalks where you have to put snow when you plow or shovel, maybe making sure that what's there is something that dies back to the ground in winter and isn't going to be damaged by that snow. So just, expect the bigger snow more often. The other thing is ice. Plants that coated with ice and break easily. So, like, I have a lot of river birch. I don't know why I ended up with so many river birch on my property. They are awful from the standpoint of sticks falling out, branches falling out, stuff like that. And, any kind of wind event, and there's more sticks to pick up. And so, each plant and each tree has those kinds of characteristics. So looking at which ones are going to be able to withstand ice storms and snow and wind more is important. And then also rain on top of snow. And then that weight becomes such a big deal. And some plants are less able to handle wet feet, meaning like packed snow or frozen ice on top. It blocks the oxygen to get into the roots, and so that can kill off plants. So looking at that. The other thing is going to be frost heaving. If we have these longer winters where the ground might freeze and thaw without snow cover because we might be having a winter drought, that's going to push your perennial roots up. Strawberries, coral bells, things like that, and especially newly planted plants. You get that frost heave, and then the ground recedes, but the plants stay up there, and that's what kills them. It breaks off the roots and it exposes them and stuff. So you might need to think more about winter mulching. Now, I cannot be bothered to winter mulch, right? So if my perennials and stuff, I'm not putting any winter mulch on it. If they don't make it through the winter because of frost heaving, oh well, you gotta be tough to live in my garden. But if you have a particular plant that you really like, or if you just planted those plants in the fall, they're more likely to heave. You need to be prepared for the winter mulching more so than ever, because you can't count on snow cover to do that mulching anymore. And because even if we get a lot of snow, because of these warmer winters, we're more likely to have a thaw where it melts. And then we can get the heaving going again. And if you are going to plant something in fall, if you're like getting good deals at the nursery and garden center, planting bigger pots that have bigger root systems, they're less likely to heave than a little one that's easily pushed up and out. So we can plan for longer growing seasons, which is a great thing for our vegetables, right? But we might have that wet spring. So again, raised beds might help with that, or berm beds. Look at varieties. There's a lot of different varieties being released now that are being released with this in mind. So shorter seasons, or longer seasons. So like sweet potatoes, right? Yeah, there's been a couple varieties of sweet potatoes that we could grow in Wisconsin here, but you're not getting the big fat sweet potatoes that they get in Georgia. But now, with our longer growing season, we can probably grow bigger sweet potatoes up here. But the gardens, catalogs and garden centers and stuff are having more and more options to accommodate these climate changes. Okay, so we're going to have a longer growing season. So maybe you can get 2 crops of beans in a year that you used to not be able to. You can definitely get more lettuce crops. There are more and more varieties of like things like lettuce and peas that can handle more heat, which is a good thing. So that can extend our growing season. So definitely take advantage of that. That's one of the good things. And then we can even extend the season even more with things like row covers and stuff, because in fall, our fall is longer. We might get some frost, but it doesn't get as cold as fast. So with a little bit of little bit of extra season protection, we can make that season even longer and be eating tomatoes maybe in December next year. We will have more and different pest and disease issues because, and I've already talked about this a little bit, there are going to be some insects that are able to withstand our weather that never used to be able to. And there are going to be some diseases that are just going to like this warmer, wetter weather, and they're going to be able to take hold more. So more than ever, proper disease protection strategies are important. That means things like proper spacing so there's good air movement so things dry out. Mulching, like I talked about. Avoiding overhead watering, because anytime a leaf gets wet, fungal spores the clock is ticking on it. And if that leaf doesn't dry out in enough time, the spore germinates and now you've got a leaf spot. So spacing, trellising, so there's good air movement so things dry out good, making sure that your soil doesn't get waterlogged, the berming of things, those are all disease prevention strategies that we've always had, but they're going to be even more important because we are going to have more pressure from that. When you're planting new varieties or your vegetables, look for things that are disease resistant. So like phlox, okay, powdery mildew gets it all the time, but there are varieties now that are resistant to those diseases, and that's more important than ever. It doesn't mean that if conditions are super perfect, that you're not going to get some of this disease, but you will get less of it. Last year, we had such a wet spring, and apple scab fungus was horrible on crab apples and apples and stuff, even the ones that were resistant, that people planted because they were disease resistant. They've never had apple scab before. They were dropping their leaves in late August because they had it so bad. So if conditions are really, really perfect, you're still going to get it, but hedge your bets and plant things that are resistant. Again, more important than ever. Look for plants that can handle those extremes. So if you're going to plant a perennial plant, going back to those hardiness zones, if we always look at the cold part of it, right? But there's always an upper end as well. So it doesn't say just hardy to zone 4, usually. It says hardy zones 4 to 8. So there are things that we grow here that they can't grow in Texas because it's too hot down there, right? And I find hosta glades down in South Florida because they need the cold in winter. But don't get something that says hardy in zone 4 and 5. Get something that says hardy zones 3 to 7. Okay, the bigger the range, the more able these plants are going to be able to handle these expected extremes. And native plants are great. Okay, now our native plants are going to struggle as well. Some of our native plants aren't going to be able to handle the long-term thing, but at least in the short term, especially for perennials, they're established here. Okay, so here's the keystone plant thing. Keystone plants are plants that support the highest number of caterpillar species. So 5% of our native plants support 75% of our caterpillars. And so if you have room for just one tree, if you choose a tree that's a keystone plant, you're going to be helping the most number of caterpillars, which turn into moths and butterflies that do the pollination and stuff like that. Okay, so it's basically choosing the plant that has the most bang for your buck. Okay, as far as the whole environment is concerned. So here are some lists, and you can again find this all over the internet. But woody things, oaks support 557 species of butterflies. Isn't Lepidoptera are butterflies and moths? Okay, isn't that just amazing? Think of that, right? But these flowers are ones that we have growing around here all the time now. And so it's not just the keystone thing, but stick with the tried and true. So if you've got things that have been doing good in your gardens and they're doing well for a reason. We've always had extremes, right? And if they've been able to make it through, that's why they're so common and popular. And a lot of times people go, oh, I don't want more daylilies. You know, you see daylilies everywhere. Oh, spirea are just everywhere. They're just too common. For a reason, right? They can handle the extremes and they can handle the conditions. And so there's a lot new varieties. So maybe you get some different color of daylilies and spireas, but tried and true are tried and true for a reason. So kind of stick with it. These are really, this list are good ones that can handle weather fluctuations and extremes.
Why do they negate Canada gold?
It's not a native and it's not as high quality pollen, I guess.
It's not a native? Is it native to Canada? Well, I mean, we're right next door. I mean, I wonder if it's also an aggressive native.
Yeah. So Canada goldenrod is more likely to take over and, fill in, whole thing. And so that's one of its biggest knocks. But there are better goldenrods than Canada. Okay, not Canadians, right? But So, the bottom line is think in your yard and garden of creating an ecosystem and have a lot of variety, a lot of diversity. That's always been the message, but it's even more important now because you might have something in it that's been doing well for a long, long time, and all of a sudden it's not doing as well. And it might be because that temperature hit 90 degrees one too many times this summer and it doesn't like it, right? So you don't want everything to die. You want to make sure that you have stuff that's going to support the pollinators, a variety of stuff that's going to survive. And when you're supporting those pollinators, remember caterpillars and not just the butterflies that we like to look at. We don't like to look at the caterpillars. Remember, caterpillars eat leaves. So people panic, oh, yeah, that's caterpillars. And that's important. Okay, you got to remember that. And, there's a saying that your garden is not an ecosystem if nothing's eating it. Okay. So keep that in mind. Expect holes in the leaves, expect things to be eaten and damaged, and that's okay. Because if you walk through my native prairie, there's holes in the leaves and everything all over it, and that's the whole point, right? So good plant selection and siting is more important than ever. We're done. Any questions? Yeah, nothing revolutionary here. It's more just kind of really think about this, bring this more to the forefront of your mind when you're out there in your gardens this spring and when you're making decisions for replacing or adding things. And when we do get the big rainfalls, get out there and look at where the water is running and see how much can you keep that water on your property so that it's not running off, but make sure that it's not running through something like your garden and causing damage, because we can expect even more of those big events. All right. And it's great that it's not like snowy and cold and we don't have to go out and drive in the icy roads now. So still nice.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
People should not complain about the